Hey everybody, this is Graham McBain. We're excited to have Teshin here from Namebase. Gonna go ahead and tell us a little bit about what Handshake is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Graham. So Handshake is a new naming protocol that, in terms of its technical, basically protocol design, it's very similar to Bitcoin, actually. Whereas, proof of work blockchain, but the difference is that instead of using the coins in Handshake, HNS as it's called, as currency, right, or as money, you use the coins to register names on the Handshake blockchain. And these names are actually meant to be top-level domain names. So, this is kind of like an obscure thing that most people don't think about, but top-level domains, TLDs, are basically the thing that comes after the dot in a domain name. Our domain name is multiple different parts. The .com aspect of it is the top-level domain name. So other top-level domain name examples are .com, .ao, .net, .org. These are all different examples of TLDs. And effectively, what Handshake lets you do is it lets you register new TLDs that haven't been registered before, and it lets you register directly on the blockchain.
Very cool. And I just turned my video off there because I think there was a little delay, and I want to preserve as much bandwidth for you. So
totally, yeah, I saw that. I turned off my video too, and then if we find the recording is choppy in any bits, we can obviously go and redo that.
Cool. Sounds good. So let's see here. So awesome. So I actually said this to a guy named John Light on Twitter the other day because I know he's been around for a long time, and asked him what he thought of this. And he said to me, he's not sure how it compares to other attempts that have happened before. So previously things like ENS, which is happening right now, but then specifically Namecoin. So interested to hear sort of like, what are those specific differences there?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And there are a number of things to kind of compare Handshake to that were kind of predecessors, previous attempts. This idea of basically what you would call an alternative root zone is the name for it. This is basically the root zone is what controls who gets what TLD, right? So it's like .com, .ao, .org, they all have different owners, and the root zone kind of controls that. And so Handshake is a new alternative root zone attempt. And then within the blockchain space, there have been basically new roots that have been attempted on blockchains, and the ones that are most prominent are probably Namecoin and ENS. And those predecessors were like very, very strong attempts at naming on the blockchain. But there are a few things that are really important to get right for a naming chain that basically the previous predecessors didn't really do exactly right. So one of the things with naming is that the initial distribution of the names is really, really important. With any naming system, what happens when you first launch it is there's always a land grab. People will come on and just try to register all the good names as soon as they can, as cheaply as they can, right? Like early adopters will just come on and kind of register all the good names. And that's exactly kind of what happened with Namecoin, because the names were basically sold. One, you could register them at any time, and then two, you could register them for like a flat fee that I think actually even went down over time. What ended up happening was you would get names, people who would just come on board, in the very early days and just register all the good names. And the danger of that is that when the names are all registered, before the naming protocol has gained mass adoption or substantial adoption, when new people come on and discover it, there isn't really much of incentive for them to come and invest into the protocol because they don't really get this any good real estate. So there are a number of mechanisms that you can actually do to mitigate this. ENS implemented one of them, which is really good, which is that you have the names sell via auction instead of a set price. So Namecoin is on set price. ENS is more of an auction style format. And that's a much better system because then you can actually have the names, basically the market can discover the true value of a name, or at least as close to whatever definition of true value you can get to. But there's another issue, which is that you still want to create a system where the early adopters, while they'll always get some advantage, you don't want to have them to have a completely unfair advantage to be able to register all the good names, even if it's an auction-based system. So this is another aspect of Handshake that's very different, which is that they actually have a name rollout period, a name release period, where on the first week you can register a certain number of names, and then each week after that, for the first 52 weeks, a new set of names is made available. And it's not like a specific set of names. It's actually any name you can think of basically has a name release schedule. And when it's effectively released for auction, it is based on a mathematical function that basically inputs a name, any name that you can think of, and outputs a number from 1 to 52. So that determines, the earliest week at which you can start registering it effectively. And so that naming mechanism, while you might think it's like very in the weeds and it's like, okay, that's like way too in depth. The thing is, these little primitives that are basically form the rules of the protocol are really important for the name distribution. And the name distribution is really important for getting stakeholders to come in and invest into the protocol and basically have skin in the game to go and grow it. So there's that, which is the probably some of the most important learning lessons that Handshake basically discovered based on the previous attempts. And then the other aspect is Handshake is different from the previous attempts because a lot of the other naming protocols, they try to basically just have a single TLD that they coin. So Namecoin was like .bit, ENS is .eth. And what Handshake is doing is actually trying to augment the entire root zone. So on Handshake, you can register any TLD. You could register .ens as an example. Actually, I think that might be pre-reserved for ENS. But you can register .mcbain. You can register .namebase. Any of these names. And so because it's sitting at a level basically above the other naming chains, it can actually integrate with ENS. So for example, at I think it was ETH Denver, one of the Handshake contributors helped ENS claim .eth on Handshake, so it can actually be compatible with other naming systems like ENS.
It's very cool. I don't appreciate you telling people that they can get .mcbain, but it's a free and open system, so I totally understand that you have to point it out to as many people as possible. That's very cool. So, and my next question is sort of about Namebase and how it interfaces with Handshakes. I know when I got started, I had a lot of questions about how involved are you guys? Are you guys sort of the team behind it? And oh, by the way, we're launching this thing on top of it. But I think another question is sort of you're comparing Handshake to these previous attempts. How do you think it's going from a rollout standpoint? It's like, do you think the decisions made by the initial Handshake contributors are bearing true, or how do you think that's going?
Yeah, totally. I think it's going pretty much every aspect of the launch. We're only I think less than 3 months. It was the start of February is when the Handshake mainnet launched. So we're very early into the the protocol being live, but pretty much everything that's happened has blown my expectations away. So the one aspect is just the value of the names has effectively skyrocketed. There have been some really high profile name auctions that have happened on Handshake. So I think the top three are .crypto, .coin, and .8, like the number 8. They sold for, I think it was like 200,000 HNS, 180,000 HNS, and 100,000 HNS respectively, which is around like $20,000 to $50,000. So people are actually going in, basically, like valuing these names very highly. And it also points to the effectiveness of the auction mechanism. You can imagine if those names sold for $10 versus tens of thousands of dollars, which they went for, there would be a lot of value left on the table that would basically have just rewarded whoever got there earliest versus whoever cared about the name the most. And
yeah, it also builds in strong stakeholders to people that want to see this succeed outside of you guys, because those people don't want those names to be worth nothing. So they're going to work hard to make sure that it's adopted.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other really important thing to consider, just to mention there, is that those auctions, it's the value. Like you might think, where do those coins go? It doesn't go to Namebase or any Handshake Foundation or any developer pool or anything like that. Those coins actually get burned on the Handshake blockchain. So when you win a name auction, basically the second highest bid, right? Let's say you bid 100 HNS on a name, and someone bid 10 HNS, or maybe more realistic numbers is like let's say you bid like 5,000 HNS and someone else bid 1,000 HNS. you would win that auction and you would only pay 1,000 HNS, and that 1,000 HNS is what gets burned. So it's actually a very interesting mechanism because it's also deflationary. And I think a few million HNS have already been burned so far. So not only is there a cap to the number of coins, just like Bitcoin proof of work has a cap, but also the coins get burned over time, which theoretically also decreases the circulation, so it increases the value of the coins over time as well.
Very cool. Yeah, no, it's interesting to see how it's been going. I know I'm a domain addict, so that's why I got interested in Handshake. So for me, it just seems like a really neat thing to. It's been fun to bid on stuff. I mentioned before we started recording that I do the Weekend Handshake newsletter, so getting Weekend Handshake as a TLD is awesome. I don't know.
Yeah,
I won't be able
and
to
I have
sell
to.
subdomains to anyone, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm happy to speak to that when we get to it. But
Yeah.
I'm curious. So do you also kind of collect domains within like the traditional DNS system?
Yeah, no, forever. I mean, I'm one of those people that's like, oh, I'm definitely going to do something with this. And I wake up in the morning, my wife goes, what's this charge from name.com? And I'm like, so yeah, yeah,
Yeah, totally. And that's actually one of the other really amazing things that I've been incredibly pleased to see, which is that there's already a lot of adoption from people outside of crypto. We have normal domainers who are super excited about Handshake. This is actually be another good interview target at some point, which is the creator of Park.io, which is a very popular .io domain ordering service. They basically found out about Handshake and now they're super into it. And they're like they're a very popular company within the traditional DNS space. And then you have other companies like NextDNS, which is one of Firefox's trusted resolvers. They basically build a privacy-focused DNS resolver that's kind of comparable to Cloudflare's 1.1 resolver or Google's 8.8 resolver. These are just DNS resolvers that people use. Tens of millions of people use them. And NextDNS is a privacy-focused resolver that is trusted by Firefox, and they actually support Handshake natively within their resolver now. So, this other company that's like not even related to crypto is a Handshake, and we've seen that across the board, across domainers and these other adjacent companies like NextDNS, is they're starting to get interested in Handshake, even though it's so early in the adoption cycle.
yeah. No, it's been really exciting to watch the launch. I have a friend who's in the project, and I've been following his tweets for a while. So, but that's a really great segue to companies that are built on Handshake. You are a company built on Handshake. So how does Namebase interact with Handshake? Do you guys have core developers that are sort of on the team, or what does that relationship look like?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And actually, that's something that we basically are just right now working on creating more educational material, just because in this space, educational like onboarding is one of the biggest challenges, and so we need to do a better job of that. So if there's any confusion that you experienced when you first got started, that's totally on us. It's not on you at all. But the critical thing is that Namebase is a company building on top of Handshake. We didn't create the Handshake protocol. And one of the really amazing things about Handshake is that the protocol development is very, very decentralized. So there was initially a foundation that was stood up to effectively raise money from pretty much like every VC in Silicon Valley, like Andreessen Horowitz, Founders Fund, Greylock, Sequoia Capital, all these different funds. And they raised $10 million, and they actually donated all $10 million away to different nonprofits like the EFF and GNU, Apogee, companies like organizations like that. And so there was a foundation that did that, but pretty much that was it. Otherwise, in terms of the contributors to the protocol and who's involved, it's across many different organizations, it's individuals, it's companies. So it's very decentralized. And actually on the website itself, you'll see if you go to handshake.org and you go to the community section, basically everyone has permission to be a director of Handshake. They're very explicit about that. There's no like Handshake CEO or Handshake core team. Everyone can contribute to Handshake. No one owns it, but it can be enhanced by anyone. And so how that relates to Namebase is we're building on top of Handshake, and we're just another company in this space. We just came on and we basically discovered Handshake and fell in love with it. My co-founder and I, Anthony Liu and I, we both come from an engineering background, and it was very, very obvious that a lot of thought was put into the protocol, both in terms of, like the backwards compatibility with the existing system, the name distribution, as I mentioned, and a few other aspects that are really interesting that I can also mention in a bit. But we basically fell in love with it, and we kind of realized that one of the critical things for Handshake's adoption is that it needs to be really easy to use. One of the things that we saw in the crypto space is that there are a lot of really good ideas, but they're just like the friction was so high. At the time that we started, I think CryptoKitties was like the best UX product in the space. And even CryptoKitties was like, oh, you're ready to use CryptoKitties, you're excited? Okay, here are like the 10 steps that you need to complete to start using CryptoKitties. And we kind of realized that for Handshake, for DNS, getting something that normal developers will go and use on their side projects or on websites, getting something that developers will actually go and adopt, not just like in crypto, but around the world, which is effectively, what Handshake is trying to do, is trying to create a secure backbone that the entire internet can rely on. You needed an easy way to do that. So Namebase basically set out to build a domain registrar and on-ramp for Handshake. So what we do is you need to use HNS. You need to buy HNS effectively to bid on names, or you need to get HNS somehow. And so we built an on-ramp so that anyone can come on and buy HNS on Namebase. You can do it with Bitcoin or USD. We also support fiat. And then from there, we have a domain registrar where the actual auction process is kind of complicated. There's like multiple steps across like 2 weeks that you have to submit. And we abstract all that away. So you kind of have like a GoDaddy like interface where you can just search your name or add it to your watch list or whatever, click bid, and then you're done. So that's what Namebase does.
Yeah, that's very cool. This is how I initially came across it. You mentioned something at the beginning there about the original project founders raising money from VCs and then donating away. This is a question I've had. Did the VCs know the money was going to get donated?
Yeah, I actually don't know that. I think that I think they must have, because otherwise, like the VCs would definitely like sue
Right.
some of the people there. But yeah, they were aware of what was happening. We've spoken with a few of them as well, so we know that they were aware of it. And I think they were very intrigued by that strategy. But that's what the Handshake Foundation set out to do. It was just trying to give back to effectively a lot of the organizations that kind of created the internet that we have today. They created the good parts of the internet. There are other organizations that are kind of like centralizing things and starting to put up walls and whatnot. But a lot of these organizations, like the EFF and Apache and GNU, they were really responsible for a lot of the open internet that we have today.
Yeah, that's very cool. And then you mentioned something else. I know that you guys had being able to purchase HNS with fiat as a sort of beta feature. Is that something that's out of beta now, or are you just anticipating by the time the talk goes live it will be?
Yeah, definitely by the time the talk goes live. So basically what we're doing is we just incrementally invite people in batches onto the beta. And the reason why is just because we're like a regulated business within the US. And so we just need to make sure that the experience is really, really smooth. It was an incredible pain to set up like the fiat as a business in the US, because whenever you're touching cryptocurrency, it's just there's a lot of scrutiny. It's very difficult. For most companies, it's actually pretty much impossible, but we were very fortunate. We had really great advisors and investors, and so we were kind of able to navigate that. But that's going live incrementally, and it should be in full public beta by the time that this talk goes live.
That's great. Very cool. Cool. So, I'm a domain addict. I'm also a crypto addict, so I may have found out about this early, but we're going to expose this to more people through the conference, and people are going to see it. If I own, I own .weekend handshake, right? Or I say .weekend handshake because saying TLDs, it's always like, it almost seems too good to be true that you can own a TLD. So let's say I got .McBain and I wanted to go around to all of the Scottish people around the world with the last name McBain and say, hey, you can now have your first name .McBain. Is that sort of the idea here? Like, am I going to be able to build a business where I can sell subdomains to people?
Yeah, totally, 100%. And so there's a few different ways that you can actually build a business on Handshake, and we're really excited about pretty much every way. And it's actually very it encompasses all the existing ways that you can make money off of a domain name in the traditional world, but then you also get the added dimension of you actually now own a TLD, which is something that a normal human cannot do in the traditional world, because it literally costs one is like not even happening right now, but even when it is possible to register a name, it costs a $200,000 application fee. So not even, that's not the fee to buy it. It's like literally just a fee to apply to go and get your own TLD. And then on top of that, you have to go and pay. There's like an auction format where you actually have to pay, a few hundred thousand up to millions. I think the most expensive TLD was like 10 or 20 million or something. So normally this is completely inaccessible to people. Whereas with Handshake, you can actually go and register a TLD. Even the most expensive ones, right, that went for like $30,000 or $40,000. That is peanuts compared to what a traditional TLD costs. And then a lot of the names, you can register for very cheap, even free, depending on what the second highest bid is. So with that said, the few different ways are, one, you can actually just build a normal product off of Handshake, right? You can have you can imagine like Weekend Handshake, to start with, it might just be like a normal newsletter. Eventually it could be like a paid newsletter, right? So you can actually have a normal business just like you would have in the traditional space. And there are actually even more creative businesses that you could build off of that, but I can talk about that later. I don't want to get too into the weeds. And the other really interesting thing is that because these TLDs are registered on the blockchain, I didn't really speak about the benefits of this yet, but basically when you own a name on Handshake, you truly own it. So normally with domain names, you can only rent it effectively, right? You get a name on GoDaddy, you have to renew it every year. It can be taken away from you at any time. I think just earlier this week, Binance had an issue with their domain where they went down because of DNS issues. So, if it happened to one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world, you can imagine it can happen to anyone. And the loss of revenue that came from that is substantial, right? Like how many millions of transactions do they process every day? So on Handshake, when you own the name, you truly own the name. And the other thing is, it's incredibly difficult to actually shut that name down or seize it from you or censor it. Basically, because the name is on the blockchain, in order for them to take it down, they would have to effectively take down the entire Handshake blockchain. So not only can the name not be taken from you, but also end users that are trying to access your name, they can access it from anywhere. As long as you can connect to the blockchain, which means as long as you can connect to any of the thousands of nodes around the world, you can still access it. So there's the one way, which is building a traditional application on top of Handshake. The other way, which is very straightforward, is you can buy the name and then you can resell it effectively on the secondary market. And then Namebase, we're launching a secondary market for Handshake. It should actually be live by the time that this talk goes live. So probably like either later this week or early next week. So we're launching a secondary marketplace where you can go and sell your name. That kind of domain secondary market is a very common thing that exists in the traditional world, and we're just bringing that to Handshake. And the third aspect is, as you mentioned, you can actually sell the subdomains to people, right? So you have McBain, you can go to every McBain and sell them a name. And who doesn't want to get like their first name .mcbain or domains for their family members? We see this a lot. It's like people actually go and get domain names for their family members or for their friends, because having a personal name on this new internet is something just like it's just very exciting. So that's definitely going to be a viable business opportunity. And the cool thing is with Handshake, you can, you can build that infrastructure yourself. Of course, you can go and do that. It's, you own the name, right? It's like permissionless. You can build up all that yourself. One of the things that we try to do at Namebase is just enable mass adoption. So we're also actually building the infrastructure for anyone to go and sell subdomains off of their TLD. So you'll be able to do that off of Namebase. It'll just be very plug and play. And then of course, you can also do it off of Namebase as well.
That's very cool. It's very meta to have you guys be selling other people's subdomains, but I totally understand it. It makes a lot of sense there. That is very cool. I mean, this is a super exciting project. I think a question that I have, and just for me as a domain addict, right? It almost feels too good to be true. So what is the major hurdle? What needs to happen for this to really become unstoppable? It's already unstoppable in a certain way, but like it can become unstoppable because people just don't care, or getting like browsers to include a DNS resolver that resolves Handshake names could be an issue.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's I imagine there's two paths. One is that like people start using it and then there's enough interested parties that it's impossible to not allow it, and then the other path is nobody uses it. Like, what do you think the issues are that can stop this from being successful?
Yeah, totally. That's a really good question. So the thing with Handshake that's really important, or any type of system like this, is that you effectively need the flywheel to be spinning fast enough to have enough momentum that basically you just kind of get over a threshold of activation energy, and then it's just like off to the races. It's growing, and you're not going to be able to stop it. People are inviting new members, who are referring people, telling it to their friends, and so when that happens, it just like explodes effectively. And what we're seeing with Handshake now is we're in the very early innings of that. So we're seeing, various organizations adopt it, right? Like not only Namebase, but then you have NextDNS, and you have other companies building on top of Handshake. And then you also have developers who are going and building websites on Handshake. So we have a list at a GitHub repository called Awesome Handshake, and so we have a list of different names. There's also DNS.live, which has a pretty good list of the names as well. And so actually developers are starting to create a lot of different websites on Handshake. And then as you mentioned, domainers are also buying into it, and they're starting to get it. But what is really important is it needs to basically reach a certain threshold, and then it'll just not only like basically grow by 10% or 20% or something like a week or a month. It'll start like doubling every 2 weeks or something like that. So that is really the threshold that we're trying to get to. And I'm like, I honestly have a lot of conviction that this is going to happen. The entire reason why we set out to build Namebase was because we had the conviction that this would happen. And this was 2 years ago, and now we're kind of seeing the culmination of that conviction. But for an example, companies like Zeit, which actually just rebranded. I think they rebranded to Vercel, and they just raised $20 million from various VCs. They build a very developer-friendly deployment solution. It's like the easiest way to deploy a website on the internet. And they're actually integrating Handshake now and supporting Handshake. So very soon, any developer will be able to go and deploy a website to Handshake with literally the best in class tools that any developer can get access to. And so once that happens, now you can imagine developers can just go on and just use for their weekend projects. They can just go and create a Handshake site. It might seem like a trivial thing, but normally if you build a website or a side project on the weekend, if you want to share it with friends, you don't really want to use like one of those like ugly URLs that the normal like deployment solutions will give you. They'll give you like a subdomain or something like that, or like a random domain. You typically want to get something that's nice and readable. So you go and buy a domain name, and then that entire process is kind of annoying, and it costs money as well. It's like $15, $20 per domain. That adds up very quickly. And so the cool thing here is that developers can go and just get one TLD, and then they can create infinite side projects, right? Infinite subdomains. They don't need to sell them, right? They can sell them to others, but they can also just make them for themselves. And while it might seem like a weird, trivial thing to have developers building their side projects on top of Handshake, it's actually very critical. There's a phenomenal article by Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz about this, where basically there's a phenomenon where the technologies that developers play around with and tinker with on the weekends almost inevitably always become the mainstream technologies that everyone in the world is using 10 years later. And so I expect a very similar path for Handshake, where initially the people adopting it are going to be people building it for these side projects or these like fringe things. And then once you start seeing that happen, it starts to gain momentum, and it just grows, and the network effects are just cement themselves. And then people will just switch their DNS over to Handshake because you have access to so many new and cool and interesting websites on Handshake. And that's a very easy process. As I mentioned, NextDNS makes it incredibly easy. It literally takes less than 3 minutes, and you can start accessing Handshake websites. And it doesn't detract from your normal internet experience at all. All the normal internet domains will work just as normal, and then the new Handshake websites are also accessible to you. So that's really the point at which I think it'll just blow up effectively, but we're still in the early innings of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's it sounds very, very plausible. I imagine it'll probably be people adopting it, and then enough stakeholders with enough clout, and if somebody comes along and tries to shut it down, and they realize that somebody who's very important is using it and goes, I don't think so. So very cool. Awesome. Well, Justin, this has been super fun. I really hope that everybody at the conference is getting a lot out of it. I hope everybody takes the time to come to the Q&A this afternoon, ask you some questions. Maybe you'll jump into the one-on-one roulette, and people can ask you what the hot TLDs are while they get some time with you one on one. But yeah, this has been really great. I really appreciate the time, and I wish you all the best success with Namebase.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.